Welcome back, everyone. We're going to talk about same-sex marriage. We'll talk about like 30 seconds about same-sex marriage. We're really going to talk about the history of the Enlightenment towards how we got to same-sex marriage. Okay. So one of the end of the Enlightenment, one of the last great Enlightenment thinkers, is a man by the name of Hegel. And Hegel is kind of famous for his view of history, or what he thinks of as his dialectical concept of how history moves forward. It's actually his whole concept of everything. He believes in what's called a dialectic synthesis. If you asked Hegel, if I put a mic in front of Hegel's mouth, he would say there is the chief concept, there is no either or. There is no either or. It's never A or B. That is a present day phenomena, or a kind of intellectual crutch to help you see the world. But there's always either a transcendent field where those things synthesize and become one. So you can think of, are you a Christian or are you a secularist? Are you a Christian or are you postmodernist? Hegel would say, that either or isn't real. There's a higher plane. There's a higher plane that synthesizes those two positions. And then Hegel thought the history of ideas move in these synthesis. Like there's one thinker who comes up, thinker A, puts up position A. There's a reaction to thinker A's position. We'll call that reaction alpha. And then eventually, alpha and A synthesize into a new dominant position. We'll call that new dominant position B. B is there. B exists. There's a counter to B. We'll call it beta. And then beta and B synthesize to a new position we'll call C. So the history of ideas, history moves through these dialectic synthesis. That there's these two positions that may seem opposite will eventually synthesize into a new position, and history is dominated, the history of idea is dominated through these synthesis. So that's Hegel, dialectic. After Hegel's death, two groups of Hegelians arise. One of them are called Old Hegelians, and one are called New Hegelians, or Young Hegelians. The Young Hegelians reject Hegel's idea of religion. Hegel has a very specific, if you asked Hegel, are you a Christian? He would say, of course. He had a very specific idea of the spirit and Christianity and institutional religion and stuff. The young Hegelians, or the new Hegelians, come and they kind of reject that concept. They completely reject it. One of the young Hegelians is a guy by the name of Karl Marx. Karl Marx is a young Hegelian. He adopts the young Hegelian position, but then ultimately even rejects that position because it still has spirituality to it, and creates a form of Hegelianism that's completely materialistic. There are no spirits. There is no supernatural realm. He creates what we call a materialistic form of Hegelianism. Sometimes that form is called Marxism. And it's chiefly applied to history. So Karl Marx moves to Paris in the 1850s, about 40 years after the end of the French Revolution. He moves there and he's enthralled by the ideas of the revolution and how it unfolded. And then he attempts to apply Hegelian synthesis to understanding what occurred in the French Revolution. And he creates a form or a view of history, often is called Marxism. And this view of history is that every society has two opposing groups. The wealthy and the poor, or using the language of the French Revolution, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Think back to Hegelianism and the dialectic synthesis and how everything must synthesize. He thinks ultimately what happens is every society, the bourgeois and the proletariat move together closer and closer towards synthesis. And they move closer and closer to the synthesis through revolutions. Of course, he's thinking about the French Revolution, but through these kinds of revolutions. So there's the bourgeois, and then there's the proletariat. They're this far apart. Remember, we're ultimately trying to get them to completely synthesize. A revolution occurs, bringing the two closer and closer and closer. Ultimately, they will synthesize into a utopia. That is Marxism, which is part of the underpinning of what we would call communism. Socialism, communism, Marxism, you kind of have them all in your mind. Communism is that we share everything in common, right? Everything is shared in common. That's where the term communism comes from. Of course, why? Because they're trying to bring about the Marxist utopia. Communism, Marx dies the mid-1800s, right? The Soviet Union arises in the mid-1920s through revolutions, 1920s and 1930s, through these revolutions when we were going through the Gilded Age and the Depression. Those arise. There's an Italian communist by the name of Antonio Gramsci, and he's thinking through the Marx system, and he says to himself, one of the things that the bourgeois have going for them is the hegemony. The hegemony. One of the great forces the bourgeois, this is in the 1920s, have is they not only control means of production, not only control all the capital, but they're the cultural force. They dictate cultural norms, and these cultural norms have a power to them, and that power is called the hegemony. Cultural hegemony or hegemony is the dominance of one social group's values, beliefs, practices over others. So he's saying you can't just, in the 1920s, as the communist revolution is happening, socialist revolution is happening, he's going to go and say, look, guys, if you just take the means of production, that's not good enough. If you just take all the capital and then give it to the people, that won't be good enough because of the hegemony. Because these values and beliefs of the bourgeois are so engraved in people, it won't work. So, when the Soviet project failed, a lot of socialists had to ask themselves why. Why did this Soviet project fail? The answer they gave was the hegemony. They went back to Gramsci and said, the problem was we didn't count for how strong the Christian hegemony was, how strong the dominant values of Eastern Europe, Eastern Orthodoxy, was of the time. So we need to deconstruct the values and beliefs that are dominated by the bourgeois. That we have to deconstruct this hegemony. One of the hegemonies is traditional marriage. One of the great values that they thought, the Soviets, one of the great problems with the Soviets is they saw these traditional families. So they have to deconstruct, the hegemony has to deconstruct traditional values. Okay, everyone thinking caps on. Thinking caps on. There's the bourgeois and the proletariat. We can call them the dominant class and the oppressed class, however you want to think of them. What class is traditional marriage? What that value, who is it associated with? That value is associated with the bourgeois. Homosexual marriage, who is that associated with? That's associated with the proletariat. So if I want those to synthesize, I have to prop up the same-sex marriage one. I have to deconstruct the hegemony through what we call cultural revolution, or whatever we want to call it, to bring those two positions together. That's why in our modern times, same-sex marriage has become a thing. Because of this worldview of the bourgeois, proletariat, the dominant or oppressed class, however your mind's thinking about that, because of that view, and because of one view being associated with the hegemony or the bourgeois, and one view being associated with the proletariat. So that's just the worldview. When you're thinking about same-sex marriage, that's just the worldview behind it, a form of what we would call cultural Marxism, or however you want to call it. All right, until next time.